Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and friends, thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Anita Bhatia, and I am Assistant Secretary General and Deputy Executive Director of UN Women. It is my honor to co-chair, together with Rosalía Arteaga, the former President of Ecuador, this first session of the Women Political Leaders Summit 2021 on leadership qualities. Let us begin by recalling that women are still largely underrepresented in political and public life around the world. Globally, women hold only 1/4 of parliamentary seats, and in only 24 countries are there higher level positions in state or government held by women. 117 countries in the world, ladies and gentlemen, have never had a women leader. At the current rate, gender parity will not be reached in national legislative bodies before 2063, and not for another 130 years for the highest positions of power. And in the last year, the pandemic has further enabled male dominance in decision-making, as women make up only 24% of the 225 task force members of COVID task forces across 137 countries. Ladies and gentlemen, these are sobering facts. However, despite women's underrepresentation, the pandemic showed us very clearly that the world needs women's leadership to handle a crisis like what we have seen during the last year. A handful of women leaders have been lauded for their successes in flattening the curve, making difficult decisions based on transparency, science, and wide consultation, and leading their countries out of crisis. At UN Women, we have observed some lessons learned on women's leadership during this last year. First, effective leadership combines compassion with competence, as women leaders demonstrated in managing the crisis nationally and internationally. Second, strong states have women leaders, and having women leaders can strengthen state capacity. In response to the pandemic, women leaders have often invested in social services, have placed emphasis on strong welfare sectors and strong institutional capacity, which provides the right context for women leaders to exercise effective leadership. There is still a need, however, to promote women's participation in COVID-19 decision-making bodies. Despite outstanding leadership demonstrated by a handful of women, they remain largely underrepresented in these bodies. The pandemic has also exposed, unfortunately, women leaders to backlash, leading to resistance, abuse, harassment, and threats in person and online, all of which prevent them from carrying out their duties in public roles. Ensuring that the pandemic response and overall COVID recovery is truly gender responsive is key to addressing the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on vulnerable groups and on gender equality, and overall, it is essential to build forward better. So I'm so pleased that we are joined today by 7 extraordinary leaders who will share their insights with us. Aminata Touré, the former Prime Minister of Senegal, Angelique de Vries Schipperijn, the EVP and CEO of Northern Europe at Salesforce, Christine Heenan, Senior Partner and Chief Communications Officer at Flagship Pioneering, Isabel St. Malo, the former Vice President and Minister of Foreign Affairs of Panama, Lauren Legarda, the Deputy Speaker of the House of Representatives in the Philippines, Marie-Louise Colero Preca, the former President of Malta, Shama Al-Mazrui, Minister of State for Youth Affairs of the United Arab Emirates, and Rosalía Arteaga, the former president of Ecuador, executive president of FIDA Foundation, and my fellow co-chair. And with great pleasure, I would now like to hand over to you, co-chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Anita. I'm very happy to be here and to share this session with you and to talk about the challenges that we have during this pandemic and post-pandemic period. We are talking usually about the new normal that we have to build. But I prefer to talk about a better normal, not only a new one, but a better one, because we need to learn from the past. What happens during the pandemic? You already said what's the situation here, Anita, with all the lack of information and lack of women leadership. Of course, in the different parts of the world, we have different situations. And we, as part of the Women Political Forum, we can talk a little bit more about how we have to build this new and better normality. Because if we repeat the mistakes, the errors that we had in the past, we are not going to have this better normality. With the crisis of identities, with the crisis of global situations that we had with the pandemic, that is affecting a lot the health issues, but also the education situation, with women losing the jobs, with women losing the possibility of going to school, especially kids, young women. We are not going to build that new and better normal. The idea is to strengthen the possibilities to have new leaders, new women working very hard to build these possibilities. The world has been immersed in a global health crisis with this wide-ranging social, economic, and other impacts felt deeply through society, threatening years of progress on the Sustainable Development Goals. We now need to build these possibilities to improve these goals and to have the possibility to create new scenarios with more women leading process and a global scenario, but also in the local in the local places, like having these local authorities also encouraging more women to participate, young students, young professionals, to do this job for a better understanding.
Thank you so much, Rosalía. And it is now my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Aminata Touré, the former Prime Minister of Senegal and women political leader, global ambassador for vaccination. As a woman leader who has held several prominent positions in your own country and internationally, we are very eager to hear from you how we can transform leadership as we know it. Here is my question to you, as well as to the following speakers. A new normal requires a new kind of leadership. As a world in transition aspires to a better future, how can we transform leadership, and what do you think are the most important qualities that are needed to build forward better? Keeping in mind, of course, that so many of the pioneering advances that are making it possible to address this crisis now have been developed, by the way, by women scientists. So with that, over to you.
Leadership is what we all look up to in this difficult time of COVID-19. And in the phase of recovery, what we will need is, first of all, compassionate leadership, a true compassionate leadership, not fake compassionate leadership, which means that we have to really take care of the most vulnerable of us. We have to make sure that the rights and needs of each of us is taken into consideration. In a very practical way, we have to look into the rights of women. The pandemic had a very hard impact on them. We have to look into the rights of young people. These are the two groups that the new leadership we look up to will have to put at the core of the programs and policies, which means that we really need to allocate significant budgets to make sure that these two groups that represent the majority of our population are taken care of, are offered the best opportunities to succeed, and their right to participate are ensured. We need more than ever compassionate leadership, inclusive leadership, a leadership that is held accountable to results. That's what we look up to. And I think that the only opportunity that this terrible pandemic offered to us is to reinvent the leadership that the people can look up to. As I said, a leadership that delivers to the most vulnerable, that delivers to those who need to recover economically, socially, and culturally.
Thank you, Aminata, for your response. And I want to introduce the second speaker in this day, Angelique de Vries Schipperhin. She is Executive Vice President and CEO of Northern Europe at Salesforce.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to be among such a great group of women leaders. And it's clear we are in a unique moment of change. Right now, we have an opportunity to transform leadership and leave a lasting impact. At Salesforce, we've seen the transformative power of leadership as a theme throughout this period of disruption. One key learning is to take a human-centered approach to leadership. This means putting your key stakeholders, your customers, your employees, your communities at the center of everything you do. And in the wake of COVID-19, empathy matters more than ever. It's so important to practice deep listening with each other. It can be very powerful to simply ask people how they feel and truly listen to their response. Many are struggling with feelings of uncertainty and isolation in this new world. Now, the time for leaders is to build a better connection and engage more meaningfully. In my experience, the most effective leaders take a mindful, value driven approach by developing emotional agility. Just as business is expected to be increasingly agile in our complex, fast changing economy, the ability to manage one's thoughts and feelings, as well as acknowledging where others are coming from, is essential to success. Looking forward, a few leadership traits stand out as essential to a better future. First, we need integrity to uphold high ethical standards, commit to addressing inequalities, and minimizing unconscious bias. Next, we need innovative leaders who are entrepreneurs and who can come up with ideas, but also recognize smart ideas and motivate the people around them to turn that into reality. Lastly, with so much noise and distraction in daily life, leaders must have focus to achieve big results. Beyond individual leadership traits, I want to highlight how business needs to be a force of change. Equality is one of our highest values at Salesforce. We strive to remove hurdles and provide flexible options to help women create their own version of success. Our goal is to create a workforce that reflects society and where everyone can feel seen, valued, and heard. Of course, this vision isn't ours alone. It's important to join forces, and this is why our partnership and commitment to women political leaders and Generation Equality Forum is essential. As hard as the past year have been, I remain optimistic as ever about our ability to build a better world because we are building it in partnership with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Angelique, so much for highlighting that leaders must have integrity, motivation, and the focus to build forward. And thank you also for reiterating your commitment to the Generation Equality Forum. Our next panelist now is Ms. Christine Heenan, who is Flagship Senior Partner and Chief Communications Officer. She oversees communications, external affairs, brand, and marketing. She is the founder and former president of the Clarendon Group, a consulting firm focused on social impact, communications, advocacy, and leadership voice. Over to you, Christine.
When I think about the leadership qualities needed in a new normal, I think we should start with the old normal. And how did we look at leadership then? What do we want to keep from that? And what do we want to toss over and not return to? For one thing, in the old normal, pre-pandemic, women were making gains in the workforce and in leadership posts in all sectors, but at much too slow a pace. We all know that women have paid a higher price in the pandemic, particularly those with high demands, both at work and at home, and we can't go backward. We need to both keep the gains we were making, but accelerate them. Secondly, leaders were newly focused on diversity and equity. And I think that's an important thing that we need to accelerate as well. It will help women, but also others for whom the path to leadership has been blocked or slowed. And finally, importantly, purpose was making its way into the boardroom. Companies were asking themselves, what is important beyond the bottom line? To whom do we owe obligations beyond shareholders? These are very important questions for leadership in a new normal as well as the old normal. So what's worth throwing over from before? For one thing, work was organized far too much as in office, in the seat, and that's how reward happened. We learned from the pandemic that workers and leaders who deliver can deliver from anywhere. And that is going to definitely benefit women and others who need time away from a physical office to also meet competing demands, but are committed to their jobs, committed to their organizations, and committed to leading. Secondly, in the old normal, risk-taking was often valued as a sign of leaderly bravery, risk-taking for the sake of risks. And male leaders who took risks that didn't work out were often given a pass, whereas women leaders who took risks that didn't work out were often paying a higher price with their reputation at work or with their jobs themselves. We can't have that carry forward. We need to take risks, of course, but in a calculated way, and we need to reward and punish risk-taking in equal measure, male or female leader. So what else do we need in the new normal? Number one, we need leaders who are listeners. We learned through the pandemic that not listening to science, not listening to what was happening on the ground had devastating, even deadly effect. Leaders who listen are leaders who will make a difference and make an impact in every sector. I think this particularly benefits women who are natural listeners and consensus builders. That brings me to my second piece. And in the new normal, we need to understand that decisiveness and consensus building are not at odds. They can coexist. We need to look no further than countries like Germany, New Zealand, Finland, Denmark, where women led the pandemic response with decisiveness and consensus building and inclusivity. There are many challenges where leadership doesn't work without followership. And followership involves listening and consensus building, as well as being decisive and taking calculated risks. Finally, we need to recognize that wherever you lead and whatever you lead, a company, a coalition, a country, you lead in a larger context. We need to understand that larger context, the context of an inequality crisis, a climate crisis, and leaders need to multitask in addressing their global challenges, their local challenges, their intra-organizational challenges. Women have been multitasking for millennia, so I also think that new aspect of leadership in a new normal will benefit women leaders.
Thanks, Christine, for the highlights and all the lights that you put on your response. And I want to introduce the next speaker. Next speaker is Isabel Saint-Malo. She is the Vice President and Minister of Foreign Affairs of Panama during 2014-2019. She is also a special envoy to Latin America, Panama from Women Political Leaders. Welcome, Isabel.
Hello, everyone. I would like to thank Silvana Koch for her leadership with WPL and her amazing team that make everything that WPL does possible. My warm regards as well to Amina Mohamed as chair of this event, and to the co-chairs of the roundtable, my friend Anita Bhatia and Rosalía Arteaga. My best regards to panel members as well. Each of you are very accomplished on your own. Let's talk about transforming leadership and why is it important to transform leadership after COVID? Well, we've been talking a lot about building a new normal. To build this new normal, we need to do things differently. And this includes having women sitting at the table, ensure women participation. Throughout the pandemic, we have seen the difference in leadership between men and women heads of state, for example, even though we have right now only 21, I believe, heads of state around the world, we have seen the difference. Let's mention, and this has been written about quite often, let's mention Angela Merkel, let's mention Jacinda Ardern. What can we identify from the difference in leadership from these women, from their male colleagues? Well, there is compassion in their leadership, and also there is transparency. I think this is core to women leadership, and this is very important. If I look at my own history, and my country's history, for example, when Panama decided to invite Cuba to the Summit of the Americas that had taken place for almost 30 years without Cuba's participation, how did we go about this? We went about it in a very transparent fashion, sharing with our partners and the summit's members the decision we had taken early on, why we had taken it, what was the support for that decision. And I think this is central. This is central in terms of the future, in terms of democracy, in terms of maintaining peace and security. We have seen in parallel the rising of inequalities throughout the pandemic, how women have taken on additional roles with their children's education and with their care at home. Leadership requires change if we wish to do things differently, if we wish to build better. Incorporating women will ensure more balanced decisions, the way we have seen already in many areas where we have already included women for leadership. I would encourage everyone to look at the Reykjavik manual, which has some specific tools and guidance and recommendations, and to follow it and to try to incorporate into every decision for different stakeholders, private sector, the government, civil society, the things that we can continue to make to ensure that we incorporate women and then build a better future with inclusion, with participation from all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Isabel, for advocating for a new type of leadership that is transformative in striving towards compassion and transparency. Indeed, the pandemic has shown all of us how central these qualities are to overcome inequalities. Let us now move on to our next speaker, so please allow me to introduce Lauren Legarda, Deputy Speaker of the House of Representatives in the Philippines and WPL Global Ambassador for Disaster Risk Reduction, Climate Change, and the Environment. Over to you, Lauren.
The Philippines is well aware of the important role that women have to play in the work to build forward amid this pandemic. Our experience working in the environment has shown that there really is no climate justice without gender justice, and that with better gender equality comes better environmental outcomes. And it is with these lessons in mind that we call for the greater participation of women in nurturing the better normal. Guided by these insights, we will continue to push for the equal participation of women, not just aiming for a balance of numbers, but for their genuine, equitable, and meaningful participation. We will continue to work to realize more enablers as we pave the way for our fellow women leaders in all levels of decision making. The Philippines has already many laws and policies promoting gender equality and women empowerment. The work at hand now is to ensure the strict and full implementation of these laws and to establish the mechanisms and foster the environment needed to enable and capacitate our fellow women. We will continue to strengthen convergence across various sectors, bringing together government, private sector, civil society, our local communities, even indigenous peoples groups, so that together we can better encourage, enable, and recognize women's leadership. Together, I have faith that we will build not just a safer, healthier, and more prosperous new normal. We will build forward to a future that is greener, resilient, and more sustainable, that is more socially and economically inclusive and empowering for all.
Thanks to our speaker, Lauren Legarda, and the key points that she highlight about these very important issues, this post-pandemic and what we have to do. And I want to open the floor and to say welcome to Maria Luis Coleiro Preca, President of Malta 2014-2019, President of Eurochild, member of WPL Board, Girl True Leader Patron Europe. Welcome, Maria Luis.
COVID-19 has made us realize that the world has no actual barriers. The pandemic reached all corners of the world and affected us all in the same way. No matter if male or female, we all struggled and still are in the same manner. It has made everyone realize that we need each other and must work together. These are some fundamental lessons learned. The effects of the pandemic are crying out loud for action, for the world to achieve gender equality and equity. The pandemic clearly evidenced the need for women to work alongside men to handle the challenges. Let us therefore ensure that these important lessons do not go unheeded. I urge all of the international community to effectively uphold the target set by the United Nations Agenda 2030 to ensure that gender equality will be effectively realized. The world needs more and more women in decision-making and leadership roles. We must not ignore another important lesson learned from the pandemic. Women have shown that they are important contributors, and therefore we should be valued contributors at all times. We need to invest in all of our girls worldwide. We must not ignore the millions of girls who are being denied a proper education and empowerment. All girls, as much as all boys, should enjoy the same rights, the same resources, and the same opportunities. We therefore, as women political leaders, must continue tirelessly to advocate for the removal of all barriers that hinder girls from reaching their full potential. We must continue to direct our efforts to overcome the patriarchal mentality that unfortunately still prevails across the world. The world is in a dire need for a paradigm shift where gender equality is prioritized. Our societies need effective gender equal representation. I urge all governments and authorities to act now. Gender equality cannot continue to be a subject of endless discussion. Humanity cannot afford this any longer. We need to nurture and foster female leadership from a young age. This is the reason that I have believed and championed the Girl to Leader initiative by women political leaders since its inception. The Girl to Leader initiative is a great example of investing in the empowerment of girls. It is imperative for humanity to live in an equal and equitable global society, to enjoy long-lasting peace, sustainable prosperity, and holistic well-being.
Thank you, Marie-Louise, for recommending to us that we invest in all girls worldwide, especially to foster female leadership from a young age. As you said, working alongside men and boys is key to handling the challenges that we face in terms of women's leadership, a truly important point. And now, last but not least, I would like to introduce Shama Al-Mazrui, Minister of State for Youth Affairs of the United Arab Emirates, appointed in 2016 at the age of 22 and a shining example of youth leadership in action. Minister, thank you for joining us, and please let us know your perspective on this topic.
Good evening from the United Arab Emirates. It's a delight to join this magnificent panel of women. I look forward to learning from each of you and walking away as stronger leaders. The onset of COVID-19 exacerbated youth battles with employment, mental health, isolation, and deprivation of celebrating critical milestones like graduations, birthdays, and in-school learning. With increased dose of uncertainty, youth feel a loss of confidence in their ability to plan their future. The pandemic has shown us that our world needs phenomenal leaders that create real paths to hope. The epitome of a phenomenal leader is their belief and consistent behaviors that give power to those around them and those they serve. This requires us to rethink hierarchical and top-down pyramid and behave in ways that place everyone as having equal value. What would the world look like if we see ourselves as part of a great constellation, and if we saw each other as stars, each brilliant, each with their own special light and the power to illuminate their part of the universe? With this lens, we would learn to see the value in others and grow together. We know from experience, when given the power to speak and be heard, we are incredibly grateful, emboldened, and strengthened. With this empathy, women in political leadership have an opportunity to give others the power to be heard and empowered, especially young people. This idea can be found in Ambassador Matthew Barzan's new book, The Power of Giving Away Power. He reminds us that we need a big boat to hop in with older, wiser people that we can learn from. And then we need to hop in with a little boat with younger people so that we can help them row. This ability to go between worlds is what makes a phenomenal leader, dedicated to service. We thrive when we help others. That is what is needed from a political leadership. And this is the opportunity for women, especially who are distinctly wired to cultivate hope. There are 3 key value-driven behaviors that are fundamental to building a world where leadership action directly empowers young people. Practice radical listening. Educator Parker Palmer talks about listening with whole sight. He means listening with both the rationality and reason of eyesight, with the compassion and love of the eye of the heart. 2, give youth seats at every table to design solutions that serve their needs, and then empower and place them in positions to implement their needs. 3, give away your power. It means our individual power is only as great as the empowerment we can give to those we serve. After all boats rise with the tide. I look forward to seeing what boats rise from your leadership with heart, body, mind, and soul. I'll be rowing hard with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you to Minister Shama Al-Marzul for her wisdom, her advices, and as I said at the beginning, we must create a better normal, a better world. We think that with the pandemic, we had some lessons about to make stronger the policies and education, the public health, the possibilities to improve quality of life. And we, the women, we can make it better. I many times talk about the local possibilities to have the global environment, but to preserve and to respect the identity of all the people in the world. Thanks a lot for this session and the possibility to share some ideas.
Dear panelists, dear participants, it has been a true pleasure for me to co-chair this event with my co-chair, Rosalía. Thank you so much, Rosalía. Such a pleasure to have been with you in this event. Our speakers raised many excellent points and made the discussion truly rich. I'd like to conclude by offering just 3 reflections. First, we saw during the pandemic that the great bulk of work done on the front lines of dealing with the pandemic was done by women. Worldwide, we know that 72% of nurses are women. and most healthcare workers and many of the workers who kept us going through the pandemic were women. And yet, we saw such a huge disparity between those women who were carrying the world on their shoulders as workers and as caregivers. And the disparity was stark because we did not see the same representation in terms of leadership and decision making during the pandemic. This, ladies and gentlemen, is an unacceptable state of affairs. And gender equality remains a large and unfinished business that we need very proactive measures to deal with. The second reflection I'd like to offer is that when there are special measures put in place, things can change. So we need, with a sense of urgency, to implement special measures all over the world so that we can see these terrible numbers change quickly and in our lifetimes. And third, we actually have evidence now. We had it before the pandemic, but the pandemic gave us very clear evidence that when you have women in leadership positions, you actually have better outcomes. And that by itself should be enough to convince policymakers, private sector, civil society, and all of society that there is nothing better than a world in which women have an equal share in decision making, in political participation, and in power. Thank you so much to everybody who joined us today. And I would now like to, before we close the session, to pass the floor to the co-chairs of the following event for a continuation of the discussion on women's leadership in the post-pandemic world. Melissa Fleming, Under Secretary General for Global Communications at the United Nations, a dear colleague. Welcome. Also welcoming here Obiageli Obi Ezek-Vesili, who is the economic and policy expert, formerly a World Bank Vice President and a member of the WPL board. Welcome, Obi, and thank you all so much for joining us today, and handing over to you, Melissa and Obi.